Houses on a nearby hill have been completely destroyed. This morning, soldiers from Base Borden have been told to keep everyone out of the most affected areas of the city. The control center at the bottom of the hill is alive with activity as soldiers and relief crews shuttle residents around, and an ambulance patrols the streets in case it's needed.
It's May 31st, 1985. It was the last day of school for many of the students in Barrie, Ontario. Everyone in the city is getting ready for the summer and to go to their cottages up north. Nobody in the city had the weather on their minds this day, as the temperature hit triple digits. However, to the knowledge of only few, the atmosphere was ripe for extreme weather, specifically tornadoes. At around 2:45 p.m., isolated thunderstorms began forming across southern Ontario. A tornado formed over the Bruce Peninsula just under 25 kilometers north of the town of Wyerton. The tornado would strike a farm in the community of Hope Nest, specifically Roger Menere's property. Roger's barn was destroyed, his van thrown meters away, 2 boats, a small sailboat thrown 80 meters, and an aluminum rowboat that was never seen again. The tornado uprooted and snapped trees before entering Georgian Bay and dissipating. This was only the beginning for the day. As the day progressed, new thunderstorms were produced and began racing across southern Ontario. At around 4:15 p.m., a new tornado was approaching the town of Grand Valley, Ontario. It would tear across power lines connecting to the Bruce nuclear power plant and would subsequently cut power out to the many areas of southern Ontario, including the city of Barrie. Because of this, workers would be let free to go home early. Little did anyone know this incident would save countless lives an hour later. Sometime around 5 p.m., a raging supercell that had produced 4 tornadoes, including one near Corberton, Ontario, which was later rated an F3, would cycle again and drop a new tornado over the wilds at Cedar Valley Golf Course, west of Barrie. The tornado was witnessed touching down by Evelyn Fisher, who was looking out of her basement laundry window. She watches the black funnel, with the sound of a train, race towards her home as she ducks under a counter. Evelyn Fisher's split-level home along County Road 31 had been halfway swept away, as 2 walls and the kitchen roof were gone. Also on the property, a barn was demolished and a tree was stripped of its leaves. The tornado would rapidly intensify and grow to its widest of 600 meters, or 1/3 of a mile in diameter, and begin scouring the ground, which is often an indicator of a strong tornado. The tornado would strike a pine forest plantation on the south side of Arda Road, snapping trees 2 meters above the ground and permanently bending many others. The damage in this plantation was visible by satellite. The tornado would sidestep a derelict farmstead, saving it from being destroyed, as it would set its sights on a group of 12 homes on Arda Road. As the tornado crossed Arda Road, 12 homes were directly in the path of the monster heading their way. According to the Barrie Banner book, of the 12 homes, 8 suffered significant damage, with one being completely swept away, with his basement sucked out, likely referring to the basement walls collapsing. Of the homes struck along the road, 358 Arda was reportedly spared of the worst damage, whilst the neighboring home of 354 Arda was leveled and almost completely swept away. Bernice and Maurice Gosselin were one of the many families living along Arda Road. Whilst in the living room of their 150-year-old home, they noticed a large uprooted tree being thrown right towards their window, nearly smashing through if it wasn't for a large boulder and a great maple tree on their front lawn getting in the way. The Goslins reported feeling as if they were being pulled out of their home as the tornado struck. Maurice Gosselin credited the large 18-inch walls and the rocks piled around the basement's foundation as the reason only the roof received large amounts of damage. Doris Rush, who lived at 170 Arda Road, was caught off guard by the tornado. According to her, the tornado struck so fast that she didn't know what it even looked like, as her car was crushed and the trees on her property were uprooted and lost. It should be known that Doris's property was not hit by the actual tornado, but rather the rear flank downdraft. Rear flank downdraft is a surge of cooler, fast-moving air that drops from the storm and then spreads outward in all directions when it hits the ground. As it wraps around the tornado, this air can rush across open areas and neighborhoods well away from the funnel itself, producing sudden, damaging, straight-lined winds. These winds can knock down trees, toss debris, and damage buildings even if the tornado never passes directly over those locations. This part of the tornado's life was likely its most intense, but we can't know for certain because there were so few structures in the path at the time. Today, that same area is covered with neighborhoods and subdivisions, many of which would have suffered severe damage had they existed then. Up to this point, the tornado had only caused minor damage to homes, but that is all about to change. A subdivision did exist in that part of Barrie at the time, never officially named, but known as the Crawford Street and Patterson Road subdivision, built sometime in the late 1960s and early 1970s. It was made up of modest, ranch-style homes, many sitting on simple cinder block foundations. Against the tornado's estimated 300 km/h winds, these structures stood almost no chance. What had once been an ordinary, quiet neighborhood was suddenly positioned directly in the path of a force beyond anything it was ever designed to withstand. Margaret and Merle Bodenham and their son Jamie were in their home at 124 Patterson Road when the tornado struck. Their daughter, Paula, however, wasn't. The Bodenhams were ejected from their home, but luckily everyone in the home survived. After the tornado passed, their first thought was where their daughter was, as she was last known playing hangman with her best friend and neighbor, Nikki Lee Lefebvre. A couple doors down, 14-year-old Todd Wilson was home as the tornado struck. He was able to reach his basement in time, but unfortunately, it wasn't enough to save him. He was tossed around, eventually landing onto the property of Larry Goldsmith. Larry Goldsmith was home with his family in their house too. After the tornado struck, Larry would escape the rubble to check the aftermath. Not only would he find destruction, he would find death. Hanging in a tree was the lifeless body of Todd Wilson, and nearby on his front lawn was the body of Paula Bodenham, also dead. Paula Bodenham was likely the first to die from the tornado, caught outside as the tornado swept her away. She was only 9 years old when she passed away, and she would be 49 years old today. Todd Wilson did all the right things in this scenario, however, it just wasn't enough. He was 14 years old when he passed away, and he would be 54 years old today. After the tornado had passed and Todd Wilson's body was found, his family had to search through the rubble of their home to find anything they could remember him by, something no family would ever want to go through. Unlike Paula Bodenham, Nikki Lee Lefebvre made it to her home that night as her mother, Patricia Lefebvre, watched the skies grow dark. As the local paper boy delivered their mail, she urged him to head home straight away, which he did. She called the boy's mother to learn that the boy had indeed made it home safely. Patricia was relieved to hear that, but before she could hang up the phone, the tornado struck. The entire Lefebvre home was swept away with Patricia, Nikki Lee, and 5-year-old Daniel Lefebvre inside. Both Patricia and Daniel Lefebvre were thrown up to 200 yards away to their deaths. Patricia was 30 years old and would be 70 years old today. Danny was only 5 years old and would be 45 years old today. Nikki Lee would be found alive and would be rushed to Toronto Sick Children's Hospital, where she would spend 2 weeks in a coma, but would eventually make a recovery. Terry Lefebvre would later come home from work to find the house gone and his wife and son dead. Both Terry and Nikki Lee lost almost everything within a few seconds. Wilhelmina Schoneveld was in the kitchen of her home at 132 Patterson Road with her brother who was visiting from the Netherlands. Her son Ron was also in the house with them. Her husband Arend and another of her sons, Ed, were on the porch. Another son, Mike, was in the garage in the process of parking his car. And the last son, Chris, was visiting his friends, the Noble family, who lived at 152 Patterson Road. Arend attempted to call Chris as the rain started pouring heavily, to which Chris ignored. As Arend and Ed were on the porch, they began noticing trees being uprooted and thrown in the distance. They made a run into the house for safety, but weren't able to open the door due to the pressure of the winds holding it closed. As the tornado engulfed the neighborhood, the door flung open and sucked Arend and Ed inside. They recalled the house spinning around on its foundation before the house was torn apart. Ed would wake up in a daze in the debris of his home, near his mother. He struggled to crawl over to her, and once he came to, he found her body, lifeless. Wilhelmina Schoneveld was 66 years old at the time of the tornado. She would be 106 years old today. Chris Schoneveld and the Noble family were also in the path of the tornado, but luckily the outer winds only. Their home would be safe from the core of the tornado, but their roof was still torn off. Nobody in the home was injured. Vern and Natalie Ferrier were in the garage of their home at 142 Patterson Road, visiting with friends as the tornado swept their home away. Both Vern and Natalie were picked up and tossed around. Vern was struck in the head by a heavy farm plow, and Natalie was buried under bits of trees, but fortunately everybody in the house escaped with their lives. As rescuers entered the Crawford Street subdivision, they were met with true horror. Home after home swept to bare foundations and granulated into small pieces. Personal belongings of strangers were strewn all over the place. Trees were completely debarked and denuded of their branches. Vehicles and farm machinery were tossed like toys, and even one vehicle was stripped completely down to its bare metal frame and wrapped around a tree. The survivors' eyes were reddened by the dust, and their faces grim with strain. Christmas decorations, Cabbage Patch dolls, telephones, hockey equipment, cassette tapes, and even a copy of the essential works of Marxism were found amongst the rubble. Where the tornado exited the neighborhood now exists a park, which many residents of the area go for recreation, unaware of the true destruction that occurred in the same exact place 40 years ago. In total, 5 people were killed in the Crawford Street subdivision: Paula Bodenham, Todd Wilson, Patricia Lefebvre, Daniel Lefebvre, and Wilhelmina Schoneveld. Just off of Highway 400 in Barrie exists a popular exit that leads onto Essa Road. If you turn onto Essa Road going south, you will come across the Morrow Road Industrial Complex, which is also visible off of the highway. Various large factories, auto shops, and other industries exist. On May 31st, 1985, business was usual as nearly 600 people worked their everyday jobs on the muggy Friday afternoon. However, almost everyone would be let home early, as around 4:15 p.m., the tornado mentioned at the start of the video would destroy power lines connecting to the Bruce nuclear power plant before tearing through the town of Grand Valley. Without wasting any time, these workers escaped home without any trouble. This incident would almost definitely save hundreds of lives only minutes later. After the workers of the industrial complex went home early, Bill Vandenberg, the owner of Barrie Retreading, and his son David stayed over to clean up and close. An hour earlier, Bill was headed for downtown Barrie to do some banking as the power went out, forcing him to go back to Barrie retreading. His son David, who had just celebrated his 27th birthday the day before, had stayed to assist his father. As the heavy squalls came over Barrie retreading, the roof was bombarded with rain and hail. David would hear a roar outside of the auto shop and would run to the door to see what was happening, only to see the tornado racing towards them. David would yell to his father to warn him, but as soon as he did, he was taken by the violent winds. Bill, who was in his office at the time, was picked up out of his chair and thrown around his office like a rag doll, one wall at a time before he was knocked out cold by a heavy object. As Bill woke up, he found himself lodged between a gas meter and a compressor bolted to the concrete foundation of the auto shop, one of the only things remaining of the Barrie retreading store. In the rubble, David was nowhere to be found. The largest of the industrial buildings in the Morrow Road Industrial Complex was the Barrie textile plant. The multi-story warehouse was entirely leveled, nearly swept away, left to scraps of steel, brick, and metal. Fortunately, nobody was working in the Barrie textile plant as the tornado struck. However, a body would be recovered. The aforementioned Bill Vandenberg was found dead in the rubble of the Barrie textile plant, over 1,000 feet from where he had been in Barrie retreading previously. David was suspected to have died from a blow to the head, either from debris or hitting his head against a door frame. David had only turned 27 the day before, and he would have been 67 years old today. Just like Bill and David Vandenberg, Ron McKittrick stayed over in his office as he helped finish up business with another man. As the building began to shake around them, Ron cautiously walked over to the nearest window to close it, only for the building to continue shaking. Reality set in for both Ron and the other man. Both men hit the deck and flattened themselves against the floor of the building as the 2-inch wide steel structural columns and the brick walls of Atlas Auto Supply collapsed and twisted around them. Ron also noted that they heard a loud bang as the building was leveled around them. Fortune was on their side, as the office they sought shelter in would be the only part of Atlas Auto Supply left standing, saving their lives. As they exited the rubble, they were met with semi-trailers smashed together and tossed far distances like toys. Heavy manufacturing equipment was torn apart and strewn around the area in pieces, and Ron's recently purchased Mercury Cougar was crumpled into a ball hundreds of yards away. In total, 12 buildings in the Morrow Road area were destroyed, including Barrie Retreading, Atlas Auto Supply, Barrie Textile Plant, Gelco Packaging Limited, Westburn Plumbing, and the Masonic Lodge, which had splinters of wood embedded into its concrete walls. This area marked 600 of the approximately 800 jobs affected by the tornado, meaning if the power hadn't gone out and the workers weren't let home early, there very likely would have been loads more fatalities in this area. The death of David Vandenberg would mark the 6th fatality in half of a kilometer stretch, and the tornado still has ways away to go before it will dissipate. On Highway 400, the traffic was busy. Some residents were still heading home, and others were going up north to their cottages for the summer. Barely anyone on the highway noticed that only a couple hundred meters away, the industrial zone was being eviscerated. Not until the debris began being thrown onto the highway. The steel guardrails meant for protecting drivers were torn out of the roads and thrown hundreds of yards, being wrapped around trees and being flung into nearby neighborhoods. Catherine Kenwell was one of the drivers stuck on the highway as the tornado barreled through. She was stuck due to the traffic when the tornado struck. She would notice the debris flying towards her car, and with no warning, a large object smashed into her window. With no time to spare, she crouched low on the floor of her station wagon, shielding her face from the glass shattering around her. As soon as it began, it was over. Dazed and confused, Catherine would climb out of her car unharmed. Nearby Catherine on the highway, Archie McNeil was a safe enough distance from the tornado to pull out his camera and catch one of the only photos of the tornado as it passed the highway. Marilyn Foster, a teacher from Aurelia, north of Barrie, was driving on the highway through Barrie at the time. As she turned a corner, she came face to face with the tornado. After pulling into the shoulder behind another car, Marilyn was lifted into the air and abruptly set back down. Her car shook violently, but luckily, she was safe. After the tornado passed, Marilyn Foster, who was an executive member of the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Foundation, would spend her time on the weekends working to assist teachers who had lost their homes. On the other side of Highway 400 existed the Old Barrie Raceway and Casino. Dot Dewsbury, Al Aiken, and a group of other Barrie Raceway employees were enjoying a coffee in the stable area canteen when the tornado approached. They were looking out the door at the torrential downpour when the window smashed in. Any objects in the room were sent flying. However, strangely, a bottle of rye sitting on a counter was untouched. Animals were outside in the open in the face of the monster tornado, with little to nothing able to protect them. An eyewitness account from a trucker on Highway 400 claimed to have witnessed a horse being sucked out of its stall, moved 200 meters away onto Essa Road, and dropped back down unharmed, as if it had a parachute on. The horse was later identified as George Peacock's horse, named Gypsy's son, who was later labeled as the Twister Resistor. As George Peacock came to visit the site after the tornado, he found that the door and the walls of the stable were still intact, except for the roof. George claimed it would have been impossible for the horse to have walked that far uninsured over the debris that was littered around the Barrie Raceway. Although 85 horses had to be tended to, no animals were killed in the Barrie Raceway. However, 27-year-old Luc Tremblay, who was sitting in the parking lot, was caught off guard by the tornado. He was sucked out of the window of his car and flung. Luke was taken to Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto, where he would unfortunately pass away due to his injuries, becoming the 7th fatality from the tornado. Luke Tremblay was 27 when he was killed, and he would be 67 years old today. The Barrie Raceway would actually for the most part survive the tornado, as it was not struck by the core. The surrounding areas were littered with sheet metal from the industrial zone and insulation from the unlucky homes in the Crawford Street subdivision. Low-lying shrubs in the area were shredded and debarked due to the sheer amount of debris flying through the air. Nearby the Barrie Raceway is the Barrie Curling Club, which was meters away from being struck by the core. This is the point in the tornado's life where it begins to rapidly weaken. It enters the denser parts of Barrie, starting with Essa Road. 2 motels, a Holiday Inn, a real estate office, and a Volvo dealership were destroyed or damaged, likely none in nearly the same fashion as the industrial buildings along Morrow Road. In the Holiday Inn, 600 members of the United Church of Canada were holding a conference in the building when the tornado skirted past them, barely missing the Holiday Inn. The same Holiday Inn, now a Comfort Inn, is one of the most popular hotels within Barrie. However, hardly anyone knows that the hotel was a few meters away from destruction 40 years ago. Entering the southern side of Barrie, known as the Allendale neighborhood, the tornado would come across a residential complex filled with townhouses home to hundreds of residents. Daniela Aguisa was making her way home at the time. Her husband Cameron and 2 children, Joel and Annika, were home. She recalls not being able to take her regular route home and having to detour through Sheer Park. Joel Aguisa, who was 7 at the time, was outside playing with friends when a resident took them into their basement to protect them from the oncoming tornado. Cameron was with Annika when the weather became dire. Cameron ran outside to find Joel, but when he couldn't find 7-year-old Joel, he ran back inside to protect 2-year-old Annika. They waited by the stairs when the door blew in. Annika received lacerations to her face, and Cameron was also hurt. They were sent to Royal Victoria Hospital where they would recover, and Annika received 8 stitches for lacerations on her face. 10-year-old Mark Bayfield was delivering mail at the time. He had just delivered mail to William Truman when the wind began to pick up. To avoid flying away, Mark had to cling onto the mailbox. That's until William Truman saw the boy and ran out to bring him inside in the nick of time. William's home had the entire second story sheared away, but he and Mark luckily survived. Out of the hundreds of people living in the Adelaide Street townhouses, not a single person was killed. The damage ranged from entire second stories being ripped away to minor roof damage. The townhouses would become the most photographed area after the tornado passed. On top of the hill, the homes on Deborah Crescent were mostly spared. At St. John Vianney Catholic School, 600 students were attending school just an hour and a half previously. The roof of the west wing was ripped off, and multiple classrooms were ravaged. At 410 Innisfil Street, Terry Patterson heard the tornado begin to bear down on his house. Terry would brace next to a wall that stood strong against the tornado, and would survive. Terry, who was a teacher at the Borden Collegiate Institute, had lost his briefcase full of exam papers, which was never found again. Terry would also recall having a painful headache caused by the pressure drop from the tornado. As he and his family walked outside, they couldn't believe the wreckage, describing it as looking like World War III had just started. The Pattersons helped their elderly neighbor who was trapped under the debris from their kitchen, and their neighbor opposite was apologetic as he hadn't cleaned out his washroom, which was now viewable by everyone. Nearby Terry Patterson at 423 Innisfil Street, Brian Bedford was struggling to take a nap in his bedroom, for the first time, not because of his 6 children and their 3 friends in the house. An unnatural stillness was making him uneasy. Brian Bedford's split-story home had been obliterated from the foundation up, with only the garage walls remaining. Luckily, none of the occupants in the house were injured, including his pet poodle and Budgie. His 1984 Thunderbird had remained in the garage, but had been jumbled around. Mel Austin was preparing for his daughter Julie's 13th birthday party when he heard a noise that sounded like 5 locomotives moving through his house. In a rush, he grabbed his wife and 3 daughters and dragged them into the basement. As the winds died down, they emerged from the basement to find their home almost completely leveled. Mel was at least glad the tornado struck instead of an hour later, as over 20 of his daughter's friends would have been over for her birthday party. Kathleen Wise had left home early when the power went out in the city. When she arrived home at 13 Marshall Street, she noticed the darkness of the skies overhead. As she entered her home, her daughter Jacqueline pulled her to the floor, yelling to get down. Seconds after they hit the deck, their washroom door flew over their head. Kathleen's shoes were also pulled off of her feet. Both Kathleen and Jacqueline survived, the damage happening in just 5 seconds. Police Chief Earl Snyder was 2 years away from retirement. He was relaxing at his home at 25 Murray Street until his wife Irene came inside from their front porch due to the heavy rain and unfriendly skies outside. When Earl took a look, he saw roof joists, tree trunks, and tin being thrown like pieces of paper towards their house. The couple made it to their basement rec room just moments before the suspended roof of their home fell on top of them. Luckily for them, they were not hurt. Earl's home had been completely totaled. Earl would have little time to think about the destruction of his house and his lost belongings, however, as he had to work day and night overseeing the response from emergency responders. Larry White, an employee on Ontario Hydro, was calling his wife on the phone, telling her he would be late coming home as the power went out. Later, as a tornado neared their house with his family inside, one of his sons, David, saw the twister racing towards them and screamed what he was witnessing. The mother, Mary Jane, rushed everyone, including her son David and her daughter, downstairs. Everyone except 5-year-old Christopher. Christopher had been visiting a friend and was sent back when the rain ramped up and had indeed made it home in time. Mary Jane, however, did not know this at the time. As Mary Jane and 2 of the kids were downstairs, the pressure from the tornado kept the door from being able to open, and they had nothing to do except kneel down and pray Christopher was okay. Christopher had actually been upstairs watching the lightning. Once the tornado subsided, they were able to look around the house to see if Christopher was there, as he was, clinging onto the stairway railing on the 2nd story of their home, crying. And for once, the crying was music to their ears. Christopher had watched the roof fly off of their home and received a few cuts, but was overall in good condition. Boyd Reckett of 205 Ennisville Street worked all his life for his home in Barrie, only for his dream home to be turned into a nightmare in seconds. At the IOOF Senior Citizens Home on Baldwin Lane, 154 residents were in the dining rooms ready for their 5 p.m. dinners. As resident Margaret Bell recited grace, the twister blasted the southwest residential wing, and 3 windows in the main dining room were smashed as glass went flying. Just minutes before, most of the wing's 48 residents had all been sitting in their rooms. Luck had been on their side, thanks to the timing, which likely saved many lives, and in the end, only a few minor injuries occurred, all of which were treated on the spot by the nurses of the home. Damage to the nursing home included portions of the roof being lifted, walls buckling, furniture being tossed around, and a power unit that was torn from the roof and dropped on a house 200 yards away. Lauren Williams had just gotten home from work at 16 Springhome Road and was sitting on his porch ready to enjoy his weekend when he noticed the twister coming his way. Lauren Williams would hide under a stairwell from the tornado as his home was pelted by heavy objects. His home would be badly damaged, but would survive for the most part as it stayed standing, something Lauren Williams would be proud of. As the tornado began to leave the Allendale neighborhood into the Tollendale neighborhood, the storm that had produced the violent tornado would cycle and create a second tornado. This is a fact being brought up for the first time through reanalysis, as previous researchers had missed this. The tornado that had previously swept through Crawford Street, Morrow Road, and the Allendale neighborhood had been continuously weakening and thinning in size to a width of just around 10 yards wide. Through path reconstruction, I was able to find a large gap between the damage and find an odd divot in the tornado's path that just wouldn't make sense if it was a single tornado. An eyewitness named Doug Robinson was working in the Tollendale neighborhood near the Brentwood Marina when he noticed not one, but 2 tornadoes heading his way. Wendy Dumont, manager of HOJ National Leasing, was inside the building with 4 employees when the tornado struck. Employee Jeff Jones, who suffered a dislocated shoulder, saw the debris flying around outside and yelled for the others to get away from the windows. Next door to HOJ National Leasing, the Standard Auto Glass building was gone, and on the other side of Highway 11, also known as Burton Avenue, Superior Propane had suffered extensive roof damage, although the building and tanks were still standing. Also leveled was a partially constructed A&M supermarket, further down Highway 11. The 22,000 square foot store was due to open on July 25th, and the building contractor was ready to roof it in. A tragedy had also been narrowly avoided by literal inches, as a bus on Highway 11 was picked up and almost thrown into the propane tanks at Superior Propane. It was estimated by fire officials an explosion of over a mile wide was possible had the bus been thrown into the tanks. While John Johnson searched desperately for the keys to his new car, his son Brian and friends Jonathan Poachman, Andrew Coldry, and Paul Neves were crouched under a shed at Brentwood Marina as the winds picked up. Suddenly, the shed just disintegrated around them. They hopped on their bikes and pedaled frantically for shelter. Andrew, Paul, and Brian found shelter at the Royal Oak Drive home of block parent Ursula Dempsey, but 9-year-old Jonathan Poachman made the decision to bike home. Tragically, it cost him his life. The wind picked him and his bicycle up, and he died after being hit by a sharp object. Jonathan Poachman was the 8th and final victim of the tornado, aged only 9. He would be 49 years old today. John Johnson would find Jonathan Poachman by the side of the road. Johnson and a doctor who lived nearby tried to help the boy, but it was too late. Jonathan was dead. The other boys were found safe at Ursula Dempsey's house. On returning home, Johnson found that his Trillium Crescent home had sustained over $15,000 in damage. At approximately 5:10 p.m., after the second tornado had entered into the waters of Kempenfelt Bay of Lake Simcoe, it continued to track for around another 10 kilometers or so, finally ending south of Oro Beach. As it was over Kempenfelt Bay, an image of the tornado and its storm was photographed taken in Gilchrist, Oro Medonte, over 6 kilometers away. The storm had inflicted 8 fatalities, 155 injuries, and $305 million in damage adjusted for inflation. The destruction brought by the storm is one of the worst in Canadian history. CKBB-AM, CKVR-TV, and CHAY-FM radio stations were all off of the air because of the power failure caused in Grand Valley earlier in the day. However, the radio station in Aurelia, CFOR, was able to boost its signal to broadcast the news of the tragedy that unfolded. Thousands of Barrie residents were homeless after the twister struck, having to choose between finding shelter or staying in the rubble of their homes to prevent their belongings from being stolen by looters. Bruce Barrie had to stay overnight at his destroyed home at 14 Glenridge Road to prevent looters from stealing his belongings. Bruce, his wife Jerry, son Paul, and infant daughter were shell-shocked at the destruction. A state of emergency was issued for the city of Barrie after the tornado. In the hours and days after the storm, Volunteers, emergency crews, local organizations, and neighboring communities help clear debris, support affected families, and provide shelter and supplies. Churches, schools, and civic groups became hubs for relief and assistance. Soldiers from the Canadian Forces and local reservists assisted with the canvassing and recovery efforts in the worst-hit areas. Reconstruction began within days of the tornado, with the most damaged residential and commercial properties restored within months to a couple years, thanks to insurance compensation, government aid, and private donations. Community remembrance and gratitude were marked by plaques and memorials. The disaster influenced building codes and construction practices in Barrie and across Ontario, with stronger emphasis on wind-resistant features to mitigate damage in future severe storms. Today, however, tornadoes aren't known as a Canadian thing, compared to the US at least. But it should be known that Canada isn't protected from these disasters. Alongside the Barrie tornado in 1985, many tornadoes such as the one that struck Regina, Saskatchewan in 1912, the F4 in Edmonton, Alberta in 1987, the F3 in Pine Lake, Alberta in 2000, the Eli, Manitoba F5 in 2007, and many others have rocked the country in the past. The tornado in Barrie was a reminder that anything can happen.
Well, just shocked. We flew over the area, looked down on the most heavily hit area, and it's unreal. It just looks like those houses were just being assembled to be built, not to have been finished homes. And the factories, of course, hard to recognize what they were.